Very often in high schools, students learn literature. They do pop quizzes on plot details. They memorize things, they write fluffy essays, but that does not work at the college level at all. So, how do we move from learning literature and kind of doing high school level work to the level of sophistication that's often required by freshman seminar writers? So, debate case writing is one of those skills where if you learn how to argue in a very analytical, super well structured manner, not only do you have to not, you don't have to worry about being shy, you don't have to worry about not knowing what to say. You will be able to use structures to impress the people who are listening to you and trying to take you seriously on an intellectual level. So the mission, and this is my overall life mission, but it certainly is the mission of this workshop in particular, is to empower all students with the core persuasion, analysis, and communication skills to be persuasive. When I was a debater, I was often told in my early years, you're not naturally persuasive. You don't look the part. And every bit of social identity politics in me hates even thinking about when students get told that. And that's why I ended up being a debate coach, because I was working in Northern California as a Stanford freshman, pulled over to start two major squads, Mission San Jose and Harker School, where frankly they were stereotyped as not being persuasive, as not being good enough. And now they're both national champion, global champion teams. So what I've learned in my own 25 years of teaching debate, but also being an admissions coach too, is that persuasion is not something that has a particular body or a particular personality, but rather it is a set of competencies and skills that are not just good in debate, but also critical in college admissions. So a few myths that I've seen in my lifetime. One is I have to be extroverted and outgoing to do well in debate. My own dad had this. He said, you need to have the gift for gab. You need to be able to tell everyone and swoon people. That does not work in serious intellectual work or debate. Because judges are not evaluating your outgoingness. They're evaluating your structure, your organization, the vocabulary, your understanding of the research, your ability to react in round to things like that. That has nothing to do with extroversion. That's also true in corporate America. So when I was a vice president of PIMCO, having to create trainings about sales and development at multi-million-dollar contracts, what we often notice, and I noticed it directly because I was doing that job once, is that actually the more introverted you were and the more analytical you were, the higher your output was. So even in corporate sales, the notion of introversion bad, extroversion good is not a norm right now at all. And debate gives you some of those skills so that even if you don't think you should belong as a speaker or a debater, you can hit those or competencies that don't just get you into college, but also can help you get that $100,000, $200,000 job where you're being evaluated on a lot of the things we'll talk about in the workshop. Your ability to use structures. For example, those of you who may want to work at McKinsey as a management consultancy, that is a core word they always use: structure, structure, structure. And in our workshop, you will also hear that word structure and how to play along with that. Another thing people say is, I have to be on the debate team and win nationals in order to take advantage of these skills. And I think that's completely false. Because if you look at the way that, for example, my alma mater, Stanford, evaluates people, if you go on YouTube and play videos of people who say, here's my admissions application why I got in, they don't say you won the tournament of champions or nationals. They say this person's debate skills are relevant in how they, quote, their level of self-presentation, or their non-cognitive skills, or their ability to execute as a writer. All of which are things that speech and debate, and hopefully this workshop, will move you toward the path of triggering those signals to people that they should take your application over, say, 20 other people who have higher grade scores or what have you. So the workshop, now I'm not going to read the whole slide here, but I do want to highlight the overall approach of what we're crafting. This is an 8-week program that's a core experience for those that should be accessible to the people who don't have experience, but for those who do have experience, that you can modulate or change the assignments or tailor them to your own situation. This, by the way, echoes exactly what it was like when I was a teacher at Yale, where a professor will say, hey, here's a core set of readings you're doing, and there's a set of papers, and it's your job to scope if you want to do something different, more advanced, or more particular to you. And so this echoes a lot of that approach that you would have if you went to a Harvard, Yale, Stanford freshman, sophomore, or senior year seminar. Our classroom time will be mostly didactic. In other words, there will be a huge amount of content delivery, because one of the things about this task is that we have to kind of teach you the language and some of the rhetorical skills that you're not going to hear in high schools, because high schools are not designed to teach a lot of the stuff that debaters need to know, what our speakers need to do. But we will have some time, ideally, to for there to be small breakout groups and peer review, etc., so that you hear not just my voice but other people's voices and start to practice that skill of being empathetic with other people who are hearing what you're saying. Now, one key caveat on the left side, lower left, is that this is debate. So this is a homework and reading intensive thing. It will rely a lot on your self-direction. So it is not unusual for me to give 3 videos and 2 articles, and you having to read it and process it, because what we're trying to do in 8 weeks is give you a year's worth of basic speech and debate knowledge, but in only 8 weeks. So instead of having to spend 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for a year, like I did when I had to learn some of this stuff, we're giving you just enough to launch yourself to some of these core skills that you can apply in your own situation, be it on a debate team or not. So, what are those deliverables? There's 3 main deliverables. The first is some work on admissions interviews. So we'll talk about the self-presentation point. How do we answer questions like, tell me about yourself? Or why do you want to go to our school? These questions, when I work with admissions folks, it gives them headaches, but to debaters, these are really easy questions. So I want to make it easy for you. So that's going to be the first third of the workshop, is talking about how do we start with presenting ourselves and talking about ourselves. Because that's the basis before we start talking about a more esoteric topic like universal basic income or nuclear weapons policy. The second main deliverable or milestone is the proposal. So what you're going to do at the end of the workshop is you're going to write 2 debate cases, and then create a video where you're reading them. More about this in about 10 minutes or so, but we want to get you to a point where you have to argue for yourself to someone like myself. Argue to yourself, what topic do you want to argue, under what kind of style of debate, and why is it viable? This echoes exactly what college professors demand. Is that when you're given a term paper, they do not necessarily give you a topic. They will say, you pick your topic, you pick your methodology, you prove to me that you know what you're doing, and that you can actually handle this. So this is going to be the same thing in this situation, and this allows us the flexibility to deal with students who are maybe in China doing public forum with their own topics, or someone who's a fast-talking linguist debater in Texas. This is where you can tailor the workshop and the content that you're spinning to your own purposes. What's out of scope? So this is not a workshop where we're going to make you a Tournament of Champions winner in 8 weeks. In fact, I do have a Tournament of Champions team I'm working with. That's 20 to 30 hours a week easily. But what we are going to do, though, is introduce you to some of the basic concepts, like what does it mean to have a framework or to frame an idea? What does it mean to have a structure of an argument? What does it mean to preempt an argument? The kind of strategic things, you will start to get the basis of that, so that if you want to continue your debate journey, you are hitting the ground running, so to speak. You're not simply just a cold, no experience novice who's afraid to stand up and speak in front of people. We're also not going to cover a particular debate topic. Right, because even in the United States, we just had an announcement of the January-February topics. There's 6 different topics you could debate. There's no way we could run a workshop by saying we're going to practice the nuclear weapons topic. That's not accessible. However, we're going to give you portable skills so that no matter what topic you pick or what area you want to go to, or even if you don't debate at all, you have something that you can bring with you to whatever place you go. And this is common in debate too, right? The people who are the best debaters, they're not just great at one topic. They learn portable skills that they apply to every single topic across the year, eventually to the national championships too. So our methodology and the pedagogy echoes that. And finally, this is not going to be high speed and high jargon. Again, if you were to go on YouTube and put in final round Lincoln Douglas debate or final round policy debate, you may not even, I don't even sometimes cannot decipher what's being said. We're not going to teach you how to do that. But what we are going to teach you to do is the conceptual stuff that those people who are on YouTube already know, and then they took that over and then kind of added on the more specialized skills. In other words, we want this to be a workshop that is open to everyone, that everyone can benefit from. The trade-off for that is we're not going to be able to say teach debate theory or French decolonial theory or things like that national circuit debaters are doing. So that's the trade-off. We want to be flexible and accessible, but also that means we have to restrict our scope a bit. So in terms of the milestones, I think I've gone through the basics of this. But the key things to remember is that you're going to learn a little bit about how to elevate or pitch yourself to professors or others that you're dealing with, who you need to impress, who you need to form relationships with. You're going to learn how to scope a project and go through the headaches of trying to figure out how do I take an ambiguous topic where I'm giving no direction and make it into a memo that someone who's an important stakeholder is going to be able to, think, hey, this makes sense to me. And then finally, you're going to have the experience of actually being able to say, yeah, I've wrote 2 debate cases, whether or not you do debate later. The kind of thing, that a kind of work product that you can even reference on an application if you want, based on an activity that we'll talk about in about 5 minutes. So how do we get to these milestones? This is the draft program structure, but it's going to be 8 big sections. And I'll just run through them very concisely, again, echoing the word economy we learn in debate. The first is introducing to what debate is and distinguishing between debating and arguing. So debate is not an activity that's like a family fight or people who are in a couple or yelling at each other. It's the opposite, actually. It's very much a controlled argumentation between different sides where you're forced to defend positions that you may or may not agree with. So we're going to talk about how do you manage that? And how do you get those basics of communication so that you can feel less nervous when you're presenting? Second, talking about how to make your case. How do we go from I'm nervous and don't know what to say to I can present a position and a thesis, which is a skill you don't just need in debate, but you also need on AP exams, on exams in classes, etc. Third, self-presentation. This is where we'll talk about and practice the college interviewing and a few questions and how to use debate-like skills to make interviews not just less nerve-wracking, but also more effective, the kind of things that can help your application. Fourth, topic analysis. This is where we'll use the kind of things that high-level championship debaters are doing when they're getting a debate topic and dissecting the words and prompts, etc., and how do you apply that to other skills as well. For example, how do we understand Stanford or Brown or Harvard's questions? How do we dissect that in a consistent manner? In the second half, we'll get into more of the tactical things. So one big thing is refutation. How do we attack arguments, especially without preparation? So there's this one drill that I taught about a month ago in person guest teaching at Harvard's public speaking workshop about the 14 ways to beat any argument. This is a lecture I've given for the last 20 years to championship debaters, but the goal here is for you to have the ability to hear an argument you've never heard of before and dissect it immediately and be able to construct responses. Exactly the kind of thing you need to do on in-class exams, or for those of you who are future lawyers, law school exams. Then then the next 2 sessions, we'll talk about how to write a case. How do we defend a resolution on the affirmative, we call it, or the pro side, and how do we attack it on the negative side. And then we'll conclude with the key takeaways to remember, but also future opportunities to do speech and debate wherever that leads you, whether that is joining a debate team in college or high school, or whether or not it's doing Model UN, or whether it's just being a student who's doing STEM work where you have to present your code or present your research or try to get grants. We're going to try to highlight and kind of put it all together as a closing discussion. So I'm going to quickly talk about, I'll talk about the final capstone for a moment, where this is how we'll end up, where you will create a video where you will read 2 cases you've written, and present them both at the same time. This is actually a national, a nationals championship event, depending on the year. So you'll be able to say that you've had a real debate experience per se. So 2 quick pieces of thought leadership to leave you with. The first is that speech and debate helps you with interviewing. One of the key things I tell every debater is that you should communicate as if you're speaking to your best friend, but in a professional way. This is a very different methodology from what we normally think, which is we should go into college interviews really uptight, really scared and nervous, especially Yale interviews. It's, I need to say the perfect thing and I can't, and that's actually the worst thing you can do. It's the worst thing you can do in college admissions, but it's also the worst thing you can do in debate. So a few of the tips that we will go through again in the workshop, but that we'll talk about here, is that one thing is, we need to think less about ourselves and more about our audiences. So on the left side is an empathy map, which echoes the design thinking workshop that I know Kyros is doing, which is something I presented at Harvard's public speaking workshop about a month ago. But what we do in debate is we think about the audience first. We make we assess what is this person likely to think, say, do, and feel to know how we should communicate and where we should focus our attention. In high level debate, as a coach, my job is to do this instantaneously, right? When the judges are announced, is to read what they've said online, to know my understanding of the history of those persons, which is no different than if we were to go to a college admissions interview or a scholarship interview and you're told those profiles. How do we do that empathy analysis? This is something we'll talk about in one of our modules. The second tip is just how do you answer, tell me about yourself, a question that folks really struggle with. And this is where debate skills can help. So what I would suggest is using a structure and in your mind, bucketing out different ideas. So for example, what is your name and your background? What's the one or two sentences that if you were at a family dinner, you would say to a friend who you don't know? Giving a couple of interesting academic points with brief examples. So the debate skill of having word economy, we'll talk about subject verb object formation is one idea. It's one way you can say a lot of ideas without going very quickly and with where the other person says, you're very impressive because you're so concise. A word I've heard a lot in corporate interviews at the highest levels or scholarship interviews at the highest levels. And then giving personal interests and hobbies. One or two very brief things that can start the conversation. And that's the last thing, which is the framing, which is when you answer, tell me about yourself, the goal is not to give the perfect oratory or to tell them everything about your background for 4 minutes. In fact, in the debater mindset, it's more, I'm trying to give you just enough information so that you, the interviewer, you know that you have 8 different things you can ask me about, which reduces the nervousness on the interviewer side, but also helps give you more points because most interviewers, and I myself am a Stanford trained interviewer, most of us are told, help the student be less nervous and help them talk about themselves. When you use these kind of debater-like tactics to structure your logic and your analysis, you actually make it easier for the other side to advocate on your behalf. The other bit of thought leadership is just how do we handle in-class writing? Because of AI, there's going to be more and more emphasis on things like video interviewing, so the ability to communicate on Zoom, etc. Hence one of the exercises on the pro-con challenge. But also, how do we answer essays when we have no preparation at all? Because colleges don't want students to get A's based on their ability to hit Google AI or ChatGPT. This requires debate skills that we'll teach in the workshop. First, how do I analyze a question and dissect arguments quickly? So the ability to say, this idea has 3 parts, or I know that the prompt is asking me for 4 things. That is a difference between a C and an A in a college seminar, or an acceptance or rejection when your essays are evaluated. This means doing a lot of things that we will talk about. So structured writing in the first half. Consideration of counterarguments, that's our refutation workshop. And nuance and analysis. So this is where being an introvert helps as a debater or a speech and debate person, because nuances in the wording of things and being able to listen super carefully are 2 things that introverts are known to be amazing at, but also which are critical skills for high-level interviews, scholarships, what have you. And this is just not my theory. The SAT verbal has just been changed to fit this model. So anyone who's a debater listening to this would probably chuckle. Because in debate, we spend all of our time using what they call evidence cards, or taking articles and making quick paragraphs and summarizing what the paragraph says. The entire SAT verbal is designed that way. So this is why, I didn't tell Christina this, but although I focus on debate teaching and admissions, a lot of folks have been asking me to give SAT verbal training because the debate skills are actually directly mapping onto that test. And it's also why a lot of students struggle with that test, because it's a more analytical debate style of reading that debaters do every day. And then, of course, anyone who does an AP class, if you're doing what they call a document-based question, is the same model. 8 pieces of evidence, and here's a question you've never seen that you have to answer. Arrange those things in an order that makes sense in 3 different buckets. That is what we call a debate case. So these things, there's a full circle here in terms of speech and debate core competencies and skills that you can access without being on the debate team. Now, because I believe in evidence, I'm not a hypocrite, here's my evidence of this point. So on the right side was a class that I was the head teaching assistant for called The Moral Foundations of Politics. It was the 3rd, probably still is, the 3rd largest class that Yale teaches. This is a political philosophy class. And these questions on the right were questions that I helped write with the teaching staff. These were 70% of the final exam questions. So, for example, on the right, so what I've done here is I've color coded some of these words. So, people who don't think speech and debate matters, oh, congratulations, you see some of the essay questions. So, the first one, Devlin argues the law rightly prohibits certain activities even if there's no identifiable victim who is harmed. What is Devlin's reasoning? How would Mill critique his argument? So, when I saw papers, I could tell who were debaters or not, right? Because most people, when they look at questions like this, they don't have structure. They're not thinking analytically. Whereas the questions using debate language, there is an author who has an argument, who has a claim, that's in yellow, and you're being asked to evaluate the reasoning, and then you're being asked to find someone else who debates with that person. So you're quite literally being forced in a final exam for 70% of your grade is to do all these debate tactics that are often not taught in high school and often not taught in college either, unless you're doing a composition class in freshman year. Another one is the question below that. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's very large, but so where debaters do resolutions. In the yellow is a whole big argument that you then have to apply to 6 different authors. That's no different than being a Lincoln Douglas debater who has to find 7 different authors and find out what they all say about a certain topic and then pick one to advocate for. So this is my argument that speech and debate skills are skills that are directly portable to your immediate life when you're trying to get into fancy colleges, but more so to get the A's in those colleges. And then the last slide. To prove to you this is not just a political philosophy thing, this is actually an English literature class, where if you look at the questions, they're framed in a very similar way. So a debater or a speech person does not have trouble with this. So you see these questions, they have multiple subpoints and multiple different parts, which is very similar to a lot of college admissions questions that will have long blocks of questions, and then students will literally have panic attacks saying, I don't know what's happening. So one of the reasons we're doing this workshop is to teach you how to think like a debater, even if you're not a debater. Is to say, this question's asking me for 3 examples in 2 parts. And then you start asking questions that a competitive debater would, which is, why is the teacher asking this question? Right? Realizing if I don't give an upfront framework at the beginning, this teacher's going to drop my grade. Or if you write an essay that starts with, well, Dante lived in this year and has one of the most important things. That's not something a debater would say, but it's also something you should never say in front of a professor either. That kind of fluffy writing is something that good debate skills will train you out of, so that you're speaking to other hyper-analytical minds than the ones that choose if you get into college, if you get a $200,000 job. Even if you're in STEM, they assess these skills too. And whether or not you get the scholarship or that accolade that you really want. So that's the content. I've tried to keep it in